Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Italian Cultural Institute. Tonight I'm very pleased to host an event dedicated to one of the greatest and most beloved Italian poets, Alda Merini. We chose this day to celebrate her for two reasons. One is because she was born on March 21st, and she would have turned 85 today, but she died in 2009. And the second reason is because March 21st is the World Poetry Day, proclaimed by UNESCO. I'm quoting from the UNESCO website. One of the main objectives of the day is to support linguistic diversity through poetic expression and to offer endangered languages, which is not the case of Italian, the opportunity to be heard within their communities. The observance of World Poetry Day is also meant to encourage a return to the oral tradition of poetry recitals, to promote the teaching of poetry, to restore a dialogue between poetry and the other arts, such as theater, dance, music and painting, and to support small publishers and create an attractive image of poetry in the media, so that the art of poetry will no longer be considered an outdated form of art, but one which enables society as a whole to regain and assert its identity. To speak about Alda Merini, we have tonight Luca Badetti from Rome, although the poet came from Milan. Luca earned his PhD in disability studies from the University of Illinois in Chicago. She's also the director of Community Life of L'Arche of Chicago, a community of persons with and without intellectual disabilities. And Luca will soon explain us what L'Arche is and does here in Chicago and all over the world. So, thank you all for coming, and I leave the floor to Luca. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, thank you for the introduction. Can people hear me in the back?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, my name is Luca, and as Alberta was saying, I just received a couple of months ago a doctorate in disability studies. So I'm interested in intellectual disability particularly, and my work is with people who have intellectual disabilities, Down syndrome, autism, etc. We live in community together, so a lot of us live in the same home, and we share life together. It's a movement that started in France and spread all over the world. So, with Merini, as you will say, I will bring in some of the disability studies component. I'm presenting about Merini because she's a passion of mine. So this presentation is an act of love. I will bring in my scholarly background from disability studies, but my hope is really for you to meet Alda. So I don't want this presentation to be just sort of a heady biography of Alda, but a true encounter with her. So I will be speaking, but I will also show little video clips in which she recites her poetry. I actually have most of the poems here on a sheet of paper translated as well. Does anyone not have it? Okay, I have it here. Okay. So it is very interesting that, as Alberto was mentioning, today is the World Poetry Day, and it's also the birthday of Alda Merini. She has become a very popular figure in Italy, and she has been quite an interesting phenomenon in Italian culture because she popularized poetry in some way, and we will get to that in a bit. To give you a little taste as we begin of her poetry, I chose a poem that kind of summarizes basic themes in her poetry. It's called Il Bacio, the kiss.
Quanti amanti ho avuto e come mi hanno scoperta. Io ti dico che ognuno scopre la luce e ognuno sente la sua paura. Ma la mia parte più pura è stato il bacio. Io tornerei sui monti d'Abruzzo, dove non sono mai stata. Ma se mi domandano da dove traggono origine i miei versi, io rispondo, mi basta un'immersione nell'anima e vedo l'universo. Tutti mi guardano con occhi spietati. Non conoscono i nomi del mio scritto sui muri e non sanno che sono firme degli angeli per celebrare le lacrime che ho versato per te.
Now this is her house in Milan, was her house in Milan, in the Navigli district. As you can see, she has a lot of phone numbers in her wall because she used to keep her phone agenda on her wall with lipstick. So whenever people would come, she would write their numbers on the walls of her house. And this poem brings in three main elements of Merini's poetry: love, folly, and spirituality. Love for Merini is something extremely physical and erotic, but also deeply spiritual. We read, you ask me how many lovers I've had and how they have discovered me. But my purest part has been the kiss. So the kiss is something very pure. And then she goes on to speak about folly. It's interesting that she talks about people don't know who the names on the wall are. And she kind of says it in a surprised way, as if the people that don't understand those writings are crazy, while those people might say that she's crazy. So she's problematizing folly and madness. And spirituality. She says that in her soul she sees the universe, and that the names on her wall are the signatures of the angels. So notice how she brings the bodily and the spiritual together through her life in her poetry. These are very high and deep realities when we speak of love, spirit, and folly. And the fact that Alda could make these themes popular and loved by many young people in Italy, it's a sign that her poetry contains a freshness that we definitely want to look at tonight. As a matter of fact, to let you know how popular she is in Italy, if you go on Google, the Italian Google today, this is what you will find. They made a doodle, which is their animated logo for special events, all about Alda. And as you can see in the background, there is a bridge, because Alda was considered the poet of Navigli, which is an area in Milan in which there is water and bridges, and it's a very, right now it's very populated and has a very developed nightlife. Here she is there. So, Alda Merini was born in Milan in 1931. And this is what she says of her birth.
Sono nata il 21 a primavera, ma non sapevo che nascere folli, aprire le zolle, potesse scatenare una tempesta. Così proserpina lieve, si vede piovere sulle erbe i grossi promenti gentili e piange spesso la sera. Forse è la sua preghiera.
I was born on the 21st in springtime, but I did not know that being born mad, opening up clods, could unleash a storm. Thus gentle Proserpine sees rain falling on grass, on thick tender wheat, and always cries at night. It is perhaps her prayer. Now, Proserpina is the Roman version of the Greek goddess Persephone, who is the goddess of the underworld and also of spring growth. It's interesting that she talks about nature growing, the rain falling on the grass, the tender wheat, opening up clods, and the storm, with kind of a certain violence, the unleash of the storm, the thick, tender wheat, always crying at night. This is how she sees her birth. And in some way, she did shake up the modern poetic world in Italy. So she was born in Milan in 1931. She was the middle child. She had a sister and a brother. And she described her father as an incurable romantic. He was very affectionate towards her. But it seems her mother was a little more distant. She says her mom was as beautiful as a Mona Lisa, and she got an inferiority complex from her. At the age of 5, her father gifted her with a dictionary, which already goes to show you her love of words and language. At the age of 10, her dad published a collection of poems. She was very young. And she liked piano and music. Those were other interests of her. So she was definitely a child prone to the arts world. Which is funny though, in Italy there is a Liceo Classico. It's like high school that emphasizes literature and cultural studies, and she was not accepted to that. That happens. So Merini grew, she still went to school, and her Latin teacher noticed that Merini's poetry was special, and she started spreading it around, to the point that it got in the hands of an Italian critic, Giacinto Spagnoletti, who kind of took Merini under his wings. Merini used to go to Giacinto's house, where she would meet other people that were famous in the Italian cultural milieu. For example, Pierpaolo Pasolini, who was a famous Italian director, and Turoldo, who was a religious poet. And so she really got her name across these important people. This was a tough time for Milan, because Milan had just gone through the war. So there was the pain of the aftermath of war, but there was also a hope for new rebirth. And Merini was right into that cultural renewal in Milan. Just before the 1950s, however, Merini started to experience the first symptoms of mental illness, and she was sent to an institution for cure. During that time, she also fell in love with Manganelli, and this is a thing that will go on and on in her life. Basically, going on in institution, going out of institution, falling in love, going back in the institution, out and falling in love. Her poetry was first published and made popular in Italy in a big anthology that was published by Spagnoletti, an anthology of contemporary Italian poetry. So she was actually included with big names in Italian poetry circles and got her name out across the nation. This is how Merini identifies poetry and poets. It's the poem Poetic.
E tutti noi, costretti dentro le ombre del vino, non abbiamo parole né potere per invogliare gli altri avventori. Siamo ossi senza domande, riceviamo tutti, solo che abbiamo un cuore. Siamo poeti, poveri, fatti di vesti pesanti ed intimi di colore di bosco. Siamo contadini che portano la terra a vendere. Siamo usurai, pieni di croci. Siamo conventi che non danno sangue. Siamo una fede senza profeti, ma siamo poeti, soli come le bestie, buttati per tutti i fanghi, senza una casa libera né un sasso per sentimento.
And all of us, forced in the shadows of wine, have no words nor power to elicit other patrons. We are hosts without questions. We receive everyone, as long as they have a heart. We are poets made of heavy clothes and intimate heat of the woods. We are farmers that bring the earth to Venus. We are usurers full of crosses. We are convents that have no blood. We are a faith without prophets, but we are poets. Lonely like beasts, thrown by any mud, without a house that is free, nor stone for sentiment. Notice how this language, in some ways, is a language of powerlessness. Convents without blood, usurers full of crosses, poets made of heavy clothes. Notice the passiveness in these statements. I dare to say that maybe this was the power of Merini. She played with this symbolism and with her own powerlessness. But I think she was very aware of what she was doing and the power of her words. And notice also, and you will see this through our videos tonight, how her poetry was coupled with music. Merini made a very big use of television, recordings, and theatrical appearances to spread her poetry. In some way, this is not surprising, because since the beginning of times, really, poetry has been related to music or to sound. In Paleolithic times, people used to make sounds, human sounds, accompanied by rhythm. And of course, as time went by in the West, we have the Greek epic poems, but as well as the lyric poems, which are meant to be played with the lyre. I mean, just think of Sappho. And of course, in these poems, love was usually besides war, a very strong element. The first love sentences recorded in human history were found in Mesopotamia, now Iraq. They are dated more than 4,000 years ago. And these are the sentences. Bridegroom, dear to my heart, goodly is your beauty, honey sweet. These are the first love sentences recorded in human history. They were spoken to from a priestess to a king, and they were possibly inspired by a fable. From those days, of course, Merini does bring love to a more modern scene. Her use of music and her use of the media, some people define Merini as a postmodern poet. Postmodernism basically says that we can know knowledge in different ways and using different mediums, and Merini, of course, uses her poetic knowledge across different mediums. So her first book was published in 1953, La presenza di Orfeo, now in the presence of Orpheus. And as you may know, in Greek mythology, Orpheus used to play the lyre so well that even the stones, were kind of attracted to that. His wife Eurydice died. She went to the underworld, and he wanted to have her back. So he went down to meet the god of the underworld, Hades, and asked her to have her back. Hades agreed, but he said, "Don't turn around on your way out." Unfortunately, he did so, and he lost Eurydice forever. It's interesting that Merini would choose this image as the title of her first book, because the poet goes in the underworld of life. Some people might define Merini as a sad poet. It's funny that she says that poetry should be based on joy. You wouldn't think about it when you hear her poetry. But the thing is that she was, spiritual writer Henry Nouwen says that people that have the courage to put words to pain give us hope. I think there is a very strong truth to that. When people are able to face darkness, to embrace their own pain, then they can come up. I mean, psychology has been saying that for a while, that when people reach bottom, then it's right at that point when they're like, I need to do something about this. And Merini was very, very aware of her own darkness and her own inner pain. Sometimes she also played with it. The same year, in 1953, she got married to a bakery pastry shop owner in Milan. She had her first child, and she also falls in love with the pediatrician of the child. His name was Peter. And she entitled her second book of poems, You Are Peter, Tu Sei Pietro. It's interesting though, because there is a double meaning to that, of course. Peter as the pediatrician she loves, and Peter as the disciple of Christ in the New Testament. This poem that we're going to hear now, it's called Lyrica Antica, Antique Lyrics, and gives you a nice taste of why Merini is considered the poet of love.
Caro, dammi parole di fiducia per te, mio uomo, l'unico che amassi in lunghi anni di stupido terrore. Fa che le mani inghiettano dal buio incantesimo amaro che non frutta. Sono gioielli, vedi le mie mani, sono un linguaggio per l'amore mio. Ma una fosca catina le ha ben chiuse, ben legate non certo. Amore mio, ho sognato di te come si sogna della rosa del vento. Sei purissimo, vivo, un equilibrio astrale, ma io sono nella notte e non posso ospitarti. Io vorrei che tu gustassi pascoli che in dono ho sortiti da Dio, ma la paura mi sostiene nemica. Oso parole, solamente parole, e se tu ascolti fiducioso il mio canto, veramente so che ti esalterai delle mie pene. Grazie.
Dear, give me words of trust, for you, my man, the only one I've ever loved, in long years of stupid terror. Make my hands escape the dark, bitter spell that bears no fruit. They are jewels, you see, my hands. They are a language for living love. But a solid chain locked them tight and tied them to a stump. My love, I dreamed of you as someone dreams of the rose and of the wind. You, the purest, alive, an alignment of the stars. But I am in the night, and I cannot shelter you. I wish that you could taste the meadows that, as a gift, God sent to me. But fear holds me back like an enemy. I dare words, only words. And if you listen, trusting to my song, truly I know that you will be lifted away by my suffering. Notice how she says, I cannot shelter you because I am in the night. And Merini's night, one of her nights, in that period of time, but also afterwards, has been the one of institutionalization. Merini lived almost 10 years in institutions. She was first put in by her husband. Seems that she started beating him up, so he, and there seemed to be some, the diagnosis, they say, might have been schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So at first the husband put her in, but then she came out, and there is the interesting part, and so people forget this, is that the other time Merini chose to go back to the asylum, which is, we'll go back to that. She was admitted 24 times, and she received 27 electroshock treatments. 27 electroshock treatments. During her returns home, she had 2 other daughters, but she was not able to take care of them because of her depression. She says, I always thought of myself as tranquil, but in my depth, I had a secret folly. The experience of the asylum, we will hear one poem that she wrote from that experience. It's both tragic and mysterious. It's very hard to get a hold of what Merini really thinks or really thought. If you see interviews, she contradicts herself very often. She might say that the asylum was great, sometimes with a very subtle irony, especially when she felt that people used the asylum to sort of sensationalize her, as you know, the poet who was mad. So it's interesting, one time an interviewer asked her how the asylum was. She said, it was great, I got so skinny like a sardine. So kind of putting her weight loss as a sort of humor turn to the interviewer. Of course, as she would say at other times, the asylum was a very hard experience for her. She said that in the asylum, I did not suffer. I didn't even understand where I was because my consciousness retracted. I didn't want to feel all that horror. In order to survive, there were 2 options: to die, and many did, and the other was to create your own folly that you could get lost in. She said that there she learned love because the inmates, I call her inmates, or patients, could recognize each other's suffering, and compassion emerged from that. But it's interesting how she sees the staff, the medical doctors. She said that they were crazy. And that once you got in the institution, you became mad. It brings us to a sort of deeper question. And you know, I've been working with people with intellectual disabilities, and the history of institutionalization is a very dark one. Well, first of all, remember in the old days, institutions were not only for people with mental illness, but they were for anyone that were considered different. I mean, people who were homosexual were put in institutions, prostitutes, etc. Just people that kind of challenge the status quo. With time, institution became more geared towards disability and mental illness. But even then, there is questions, and today those questions are emerging more strongly, as to who creates the labels of madness and disabilities, and according to what standards. Of course, if we take into, if we rely simply on IQ level or a ordinary status of well-being, then okay, some people are disabled, some people are not. But are those foundations right or better? Are they the only way to understand personhood, disability, and madness? So Merini challenged this understanding already in her poetry. One of the asylums that she was in was Villa Fiorita, which was located in a Tangenziale dell'Ovest, a part of a belt of highways surrounding Milan. And this is the poem, Tangenziale dell'Ovest, Western Wing Road.
Per la tangenziale dell'Ovest scendi dai suoi vertici profondi, squarcia questi ponti di rovina, allunga il passo e rimuovi le antiche macerie della porta tangenziale dell'Ovest, per sacro mare debbono morire. Cioè vedere il figlio e lasciarlo, non vi vedete alcuno, né lontano senti il rimbombo del risanamento, butta questi ponti di squarcio dove i pittori dorati muoiono mutamente. Qui la nuda ringhiera che ti afferra in una parabola di Oriente, accecato dal masochismo. Qui non pullula alcuna scienza, ma muore tutto putrefatto e confido come una lava di crimine azzurro, come un bisturi folle che fa di questi paraggi la continuazione dell'Ovest, dove termina Villa Fiorita. Cioè arrivavi da quella di manicomio, li sparcivi.
Western Ring Road, come down from your deep heights, cut through these collapsing bridges, take a longer step and clear away the derelict buildings by the Porta Ticinese, so that wide valleys might be even wider, and the fields might disclose themselves. Western Wing Road, those bitter waters must die. No one sails, and from far away you do not hear the booming echo of recovery. Launch these bridges ripping apart, where lonely painters perish in transformation. Here, the naked railing that grasps you is an Eastern parabola, blinded by masochism. Here, not a single knowledge pulses, but everything rotten, concise dies, with a blade of blue crime, with a crazy scalpel that makes of this neighborhood the extension of the West, where Villa Fiorita sprouts. She mentioned two things while she read the poem. When her child was taken away, she says that one of the hardest part of the institution was having to go and having to leave her daughters back home and not knowing what would have happened to them. And she mentioned at the end that once you got in the mental institution, you went mad, which we just spoke about. You saw her on her bed. She would often receive people in her room. She had a very small room, a very small house, and people would often come to her, a lot of journalists and photographers, etc. And she would just talk to them or recite poems to them. And she would very often, especially at the end of her life, it seems, just improvise poems for them and give it to them as gifts. The conditions of her house were not necessarily the best. One of the things she says about the asylum is that she liked it there because she's a Lazzarona, which means she doesn't like to do much. She's lazy, and she doesn't like to work. So at the asylum, she didn't have to do those things. It seems psychoanalysis helped her get out, she says, or states. But during her institutionalization, she kept writing. So she was in very close relationship with other patients. She observed what was happening around her. She observed that the medical class was high up, and the patients were kind of down and oppressed upon. And she wrote a poem about this, La Terra Santa, which is probably her most famous poem. She talks about the institution and mirrors the biblical story of the Promised Land with the institution. It's in the back, La Terra Santa, the Holy Land.
Ho conosciuto Gerico, ho avuto anche io la mia Palestina e le acque limpide del Giordano. Le mura del manicomio erano le mura di Gerico e una pozza di acqua infettata ci ha battezzati tutti. Lì dentro eravamo ebrei e i farisei erano in alto e c'era anche il Messia confuso dentro la folla, un pazzo che gridava ai cieli e li implorava ridendo. Noi tutti branco da ceti, in un avello d'orrore, noi tutti dentro l'amore eravamo come gli uccelli e ogni tanto una rete oscura ci imprigionava, ma andavamo verso la messe di nostro Signore. E Cristo il Redentore, confinato dietro una rete, urlava a squarciagola tutto il suo male in Dio. Fummo lavati e sepolti, odoravamo d'incenso e dopo, quando amavamo, ci facevano l'elettroshock perché dicevano un pazzo non deve amare nessuno. Ma un giorno da dentro l'avello qualcosa mi ha risvegliato e anch'io come Gesù ho avuto la mia risurrezione. Sono tornata alla vita, ma non sono salita ai cieli. Sono disceso nell'inferno dove riguardo stupita le mura di Gerico antiche.
Isn't it interesting to hear people screaming brava to a poet as if it's a concert? In some way it's a very strong popularization of poetry. I have known Jericho. I too have had my Palestine. The walls of the asylum were the walls of Jericho, and a well of infected water baptized us all. In there we were Jews, and the Pharisees were high above. And there was also the Messiah confused within the crowd, a crazy man who screamed to heaven all his love in God. A flock of ascetics, we were all like birds, and every now and then a dark net imprisoned us. But we went towards the harvest of our Lord and Christ the Savior. We were washed and buried, we smelled like incense, and after, when we loved, they applied electroshock, because they said, a madman can love no one. But one day, from inside the tomb, I too woke up again. I too, like Jesus, at my resurrection. But I did not rise to the heavens. I went down to hell, from where I look again, stupefied, upon the walls of old Jericho. Notice how she mentions about the Pharisees high above the medical doctors. In some way we could say the law of medicine at the time in the institution being forced on the patients. And there was also the Messiah in the crowd. The image of Christ as present in the poor, the rejected, and the oppressed. So the other patients. A crazy man who screamed to heaven, all is loving God. Isn't it interesting that some people thought that Jesus was mad and they crucified him? A flock of ascetics. Asceticism, there is a strong asceticism is basically a tradition of mystics and spiritual mentors that have embarked on a ascetical way of knowing God. We hear of fasting, we hear of the desert fathers living civilization to discover the deeper meaning of the spiritual life. And she kind of compares this to the people in the mental asylum. We smelled like incense. Now, probably the mental asylum does not smell very well, but within that, she saw a certain glory that maybe the world couldn't see, but that she brought out through her poetry. From inside the tomb, I woke up again, and like Jesus at my resurrection. But I did not go to heaven, I went to hell, where I look again at Jericho. In some way, even in Christian theology, there is this Christ descent in hell, and it kind of mirrors what Merini is saying. So, Merini eventually got out of the institution. She got married again, her husband died. She got married to an older man. She always seemed to gravitate towards older men. And she fell ill again, went back to the institution, and then she went out and went back to live at Nabili. She died in 2009. What's interesting, one of the interesting things about Merini is that we don't know how many books of poetry she published. Because, and some people criticized her for this, saying that she was making poetry too pop and too improvised. Editors sometimes call her on the phone and she would say something and they will publish it. There is a publishing house that doesn't know how many books they themselves have published, which is interesting. But it seems there are over 900. I think it's Puccino Elefante that published a booklet every week of anything that Merini wanted to say. She got it published. Her TV appearances were very interesting because people started having her on their shows, and she would basically just talk about anything. And because her mind was so creative and so broad, she would just go on so many tangents, and people were really drawn to this, and I think this really helped her gain popularity. So we began with a poem on her birth. I was born on the 21st in springtime. And I would like to close this introduction to Alda Merini with a poem on death that she wrote, Elogio alla morte. In this poem, she said that if death was something tranquil and pleasant, she would have already died. But since death is difficult and it's like a wall, she wants to resist until the end. It seems now Merini is more alive than ever. She's being celebrated on this day, which is her anniversary. And there is new books that are being published and that are introducing the younger generation to poetry.
Se la morte fosse un vivere quieto, un bel lasciarsi andare, un'acqua purissima e delicata, o le libazioni di un ventre, io mi sarei già uccisa. Ma poiché la morte è muraglia, dolore, ostinazione violenta, io magicamente resisto.
Thank you. If you have any questions or reflections, please. Yes.
Is there a scholarly tradition analyzing her work that's come along?
That's a great question. No. There have been many books written on Merini, but she's a little bit snobbed from the sort of academic, poetic circles because they see her as too pop. However, there are a couple of scholars that are trying to sort of examine her works and bring something out of it. She's not very widely translated in English, but there is a great American introduction to Merini. The book is called Love Lessons, and Susan Stewart has translated a few of her poems, and it's available.
How old was she when she died?
How old was she? So, she was born in 31, died in 2009, 78.
78, right.
She will be 85 today, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Had she been out of institutions for quite some time at her death, or was she still?
Yes, no. She was out for a while at her death, yes. And remember also, when she first began in the institution, the situation of the institutionalization was pretty dim in Italy. In 19... I think it was 1971. There was an important law that passed in Italy. And Merini was kind of in the cusp of that, although she already was institutional beforehand. It's the law 180. Franco Basaglia was an Italian psychiatrist, and he basically asked for the closing of psychiatric institutions in favor of more community support services. So Merini kind of, but you know it is in Italy, and really also here. The law asked them to close, but they made so many exceptions that they kept going on for a while.
Did she live in an institution like Henry Milan also was involved with, and that you were yourself actively involved in at any time?
She did not. She did not. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did she live in poverty?
She lived in poverty, and actually, she basically her meals were provided to her by the state because of her condition of poverty. Yeah. Although, it's interesting, she said, an interviewer asked her, "Can people live with poetry?" You know, money-wise. She said, "I did." I don't know how, but I did. And when they asked her, what do you think new poets should do to, because you know, poetry doesn't attract many people. She said, and this is very interesting, she said, they should go on TV. Because that's how people know you and how your name spreads. If you just stay at home and write, nobody's going to know you. Very interesting and very practical.
She was very smart.
Do you share any of her poems with the students that you love?
No, I usually do not. Yeah, that would be a good idea, though.
I'm just curious if you did, and if not, why not? In terms of her own experience. And
yes. So yes, I've shared poetry in the university setting. Yes. And it was very interesting. I had a similar presentation at UIC, and there was a huge turnout. And the funny thing is that most of the people were not Italian. You know, I would have expected, yeah, sure, some Italians would come because they like her. But it was not. So it seems that many people might be drawn to it. So.
I'd like to know what your shirt says.
Let your mind run free, excite your body with unusual ideas. Get drunk on beauty.
Very nice.
Thank you. Yes.
Do we know maybe how much poetry that Alda Merini might have been thinking of or wrote while institutionalized these 24 times?
Yeah. See, the tricky part is that a lot of her poetry was given across different years. So she kept some of it and then maybe gave it, you know, years and years later. So it's not always clear how much she actually wrote in the institution. Although a lot of her poetry, 1/3, if not one more, has to do with the institutional experience. Yeah.
You mentioned that she was mostly poverty-stricken, so I'm wondering, of the children that she bore throughout going back and forth, are any of them reaping the fruits of her labor from the royalties of the published material?
Yeah.
Or if her family even has rights to the works?
Mm-hmm. Her
She's
family.
pretty generous with giving things away, right?
Yeah, her family is an interesting situation. Now, it seems that her daughters are aware that Merini wasn't able to take care of them. So there doesn't seem to be resentment, at least in what I've noticed in their statements and interviews. They are, actually I've been in correspondence with one of them. They are very involved now in spreading Merini's poetry with poetic concorsi, many contests. And her house is actually becoming a sort of museum. It was actually, yes, it was actually closed for a while because there weren't enough people coming, apparently. But now they're trying to integrate it with more sort of, you know, manifestations and things to liven it up a bit. Yeah.
Did Alda Merini say who her greatest influences were, and then who are some poets today that also been greatly influenced by her?
You know, one of Merini's most loved poets was Dante. When she was young, she would gravitate towards an illustrated Divine Comedy, and she would say that Dante was somebody who strongly influenced her. Today, she's influencing not only new poets, but also singers and writers who go back to her poetry and kind of include it in their own works. Yeah.
You know, I've read about Nguyen's work.
Yes.
But I've never had anyone actually be able to talk a little bit about what it's like. If you could speak just from your personal perspective of what that kind of a experience of service or
Yes.
commitment is like.
Mm-hmm. Henry Nguyen was a spiritual writer. He was a Canadian priest and psychologist who lived in a large community. L'Arche is the community movement that I mentioned before, where I currently work. I've been involved with them for 8 years. Compared to institutions in which people are marginalized and are cut away from the places where culture is made, L'Arche and living together with people with disabilities has brought up the fact that people with disabilities can show us what it means to be human. Because when you have intellectual disabilities, you may not be able to do a lot of abstract thinking, but you have less masks. Because often we hide behind words, really also behind poetry, because poetry says, shows, but it also hides. So Henry Nouwen wrote many books on living with people with disabilities and with people who have been excluded, saying, it's actually with them that I feel most human and not away from them. And today this is a good question for us all, right? I mean, where are people with disabilities? Where are people with Down syndrome? I see them because I work with them, but they're basically on the sides of anything.
But by working with them, what is a typical thing you might do with them? I mean, just sit down and talk, have a meal? I mean,
Yeah. Actually, in L'Arche, we call, when people are working with people with disabilities, we call it sharing life or sharing time. It's basically simply a very relational and human way of living together. We cook, we eat together, so it's not me cooking for them, it's us cooking together. We go to the pub, we have people over as guests, so it's basically just normal life.
Like a community. Yeah.
Like a community, yeah.
Some of them, though, improve and they can go out on their own, can
Yeah.
they not?
Mm-hmm.
Or return to their families, too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because
Yeah.
you're teaching them. They're going to cook, they're going to dress themselves, bathe, everything, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not just, so teaching is only part of it, because then they also teach us different things. You know, it's a very mutual relationship. And yeah, of course, it depends level of disability.
Right.
Some people are more able to live independently. But you know, I knew somebody who lived independently and said, I was lonely, so I want to live with people. Because basically he had, you know, somebody who came in to help,
Yeah.
clean, cook, but then he didn't do anything in his apartment. So.
Is that paid for by the government, or do you have to have money to be there?
Yeah, 80% of our funding comes from the state, which is very interesting.
Yes.
Some people are surprised, at least in Chicago. In other areas, you know, it's different, but in Chicago, 80%.
They
This
haven't
was
touched
in
us.
France, right?
Oh,
They
It was
haven't,
in Canada.
the community was started in France, yes, in the 1960s.
But the Newlands was in Canada,
Newen was in Canada.
but we have one in Chicago.
We do, yeah, it started in 2000. So it's on the west side. You're all welcome to come. Just contact me if you want to have a meal with us.
A question. Did Alda Merini compose her poems writing them or only improvising them? And did she come back to the text in order to better to change to
Yes. In her last period, it seemed to be mostly oral via telephone. The first poems were more written, and as a matter of fact, they're also a little more, you can say there is more finesse in them. Yeah, sometimes she will go back and revisit them, and actually her manuscripts are kept at the University of Pavia. That's where all her writings and collection are in order to live.
no writing with the lipstick?
No, she didn't write. She didn't seem to write much poetry on the walls. Yeah, just numbers, and sometimes drawings. Yeah.
The written text, did she retain ownership of that, or was it the mental illness that made her unable to truly be able to have any ownership of her work? I mean, obviously,